Well, thank you, Edmund. That's quite an intro. Hopefully that was recorded somewhere. I am excited to be here, probably as excited as Edmund. I am going to show you brand new material from my upcoming book, which I'm currently writing. So this is the first time I've presented it. So if it's rough, if it's confusing, if you walk out of here scratching your head, I'll take that as constructive feedback that need to go back to the drawing board. This is my first trip in 2 years out of the house, other than a quick trip to see my mom before Christmas. And so I am making this transition from the virtual world to the physical world. And I came early to New York to take some client meetings this week. And it was weird because I would run into the office to meet people and then come back to my hotel room and get on virtual Zoom calls. And it's this weird transition time between being fully virtual and now in real life. And I feel like procurement is in the same place. We started 25-ish years ago, the profession more or less, doing cost savings. Don't mind the wizard behind the curtain. We started doing cost, 3 bids and a buy, and that was revolutionary. And then we moved to total cost in the early 2000s. And I would argue that we are at a transition moment from total cost to total value. And so we are sitting in this transitory space between those two. And so I would argue that it is our business. We are in the business of building the 21st century supply chain. And yes, us as procurement are part of the supply chain. Because our goal is to build secure, robust, resilient, green, socially conscious supply chains. That's our job. And it's particularly procurement's job because most supply chains consist of external third parties. Who better to deal with third parties than us? And so to create total value, we do it through 1 through 5 on this screen. We are going to facilitate innovation, risk, resiliency, advanced cost, and ESG. And we're going to do that with new culture, new talent, new skills, which you've heard today in some of the sessions, and of course, new technology. Arkestro being one of those pieces of technology. And so we sit at this moment between cost, and total value. We're not there yet. We're in this in-between space. And so this in-between space is liminal, is what's known as liminal. It's a very academic word, and I love bringing obscure academic words into business lexicon. But it's really just that space in between two things. So a good example, oops, there we go. Dusk is the liminal space between day and night. It's that transition time. Dawn is that transition from night to day. Because I'm a historian by training, I like to start with historical examples. So let's go back to World War I. Why is World War I important? In fact, it is the most important event of the 20th century that affects what we're doing today. And in 1914, when war breaks out, and by the way, war broke out by accident in 1914. Nobody thought that they would go to war for 4 years. But at the end, in 1918, all 4 empires, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, cease to exist. And you get nation states. And you can see on the map, it's a little hard to see, but essentially, going from empire to nation state created a liminal space. And the risk sits in that liminal space in particular. And if you look at the Ottoman Empire, you can see that it's most of the Middle East countries. And for sure, those are still in a liminal space. And they're still contested today. And of course, you only need to open the news to see that the former Russian Empire is still under conflict today. So if you want to understand today's current events, go back to World War I, and you see that liminal risk. Speaking of the former Ottoman Empire, the United States just spent $5.8 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars over 20 years to help reset the political agenda in part of the former Ottoman Empire. And we weren't successful. Turns out Western countries aren't terribly successful at redefining the Ottoman Empire. But what I want to call your attention to is a trend that happened over the course of that time, is that the American military increasingly relied on contractors, or in our vernacular, suppliers. And so they offloaded everything from food service to maintenance. And of particular interest, maintenance of weapon systems, maintenance of tanks, jeeps, helicopters. And so the liminal space is that between the employee and the contractor, the soldier and the contractor. Because what happened when the US pulls out of Afghanistan, they bring the contractors with them. And that's all the know-how on how to maintain these weapon systems. And so with that, and more importantly, with these high-tech weapon systems, the contractors own the intellectual property. So that liminal space between employee and contractor is important. And if you look at military procurement today, we are dealing with, the American defense industry is dealing with huge problems with suppliers unable to deliver and the DoD able to print, 3D print things, but they're not allowed to because they don't own the intellectual property. So IP risk is a real problem. By the way, I like to think the guy in the helicopter, the Taliban guy in the helicopter, is Googling how to turn on the helicopter. Okay, another former Ottoman Empire is the Iran. And what's interesting about the Iranian centrifuges at the nuclear power plant Natanz, get that out right, is the liminal space here is between physical and digital. And if you look at the facility, you can't see it on the screen, but they cut off, they did not put the public internet into there as a safety measure. So it was physically separated like a moat around this facility so that no hackers could come in. So we call that in the security business air gapped. It's air gapped so no digital can get into that facility. Pretty secure, right? Physical, we have a physical barrier against the digital. And yet, in December of 2009 and January of 2010, they experienced a 200% increase in the failures of their centrifuges. If you go back and do the math, I'm sure I'm wrong on the percentage, but it's a huge amount. It went skyrocketing. And so what happened is that a worm crossed that air gap. It bridged the physical divide and got into their facility, a computer worm. Now, how that happened is speculation, so I'm not even going to speculate, but there's several books about this. But what happened is once the worm got in, it attacked the Siemens controllers. These are industrial logic controllers, or PLCs, and they are in every manufacturing plant, every industrial building, every warehouse, and they are controlling our dams, our electric grids, all over the place. And as soon as that worm got in, it wreaked havoc. And the only reason that they found out about this is because somebody accidentally walked the virus out of the facility. And that's in 2010, for those of you that remember, the Stuxnet worm that proliferated all over the world very quickly came from here. And this, for the record, was an act of nation-state sponsored, it's a nation-state sponsored attack. But the takeaway for this is that physical-digital divide. That liminal space between the two got bridged. We, as procurement practitioners, are in a liminal space when it comes to risk management. We have spent the last 2 years illuminating our supply chains. And I'm sure you have some version of this slide. And you have tools that fit nicely into these buckets. But that's illumination. That's not risk management. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You can't do risk management until you do illumination. So please do illumination. But risk doesn't work this way. This assumes a very linear way of managing risk, because if you look at the pandemic, it cut right across all those, didn't it? And everything from OTIF to all the way down to human rights violations to pricing spikes and whatnot. And then if we flip the page, we see the illegal Russian invasion, and you see completely different risks light up. And so this is the importance, is to look, and that difference is the liminal space. That space between just illuminating and managing is what we have to look at. Because these risks are only getting more complicated. Inflation is another one. We like to look at inflation in terms of our prices are going up. But I could light up another one of these with different impacts from inflation. Oil, another thing that will just light this up across the board. And I don't care what great cyber security tool you have, or onboarding tool you have, or financial tool, that's where you'll run into problems, is looking at it in isolation. So to do risk management, I would like to offer up 3 additional questions to think about to get us from illumination into management. When is risk? That's a question we never ask. We onboard a supplier, we qualify them, we do all the diligence, great. What about as they're operating? What about when they offboard? Just like the Afghanistan example. That's where your risk sits, is operationally and in the offboarding. And who is risk? Another great question. We think of supplier as the core of the risk, and that's important. That's our job. I said it at the beginning. But sometimes suppliers are influenced in ways that do not get picked up. Governments will exert control on suppliers, especially in non-Western governments. NGOs will do the same thing. Organized crime will do the same thing. And so we have to take the Western lens out of this and actually look. Because what happens if one of those entities says to your supplier, just dial back production by 10%. I want to see the geopolitical impacts. And they do that across that region. So who is risk is also important. Where is risk? And I don't mean geographically. Yes, that's important. But the greatest threats to your supply chain, to your suppliers, to your supply chain, come from the places that you have the least visibility, much like the previous point. And so if I want to attack your company, I'm going to come through your supply base, because your supply base is relatively insecure, and I'm going to find the weakest point in your supply, in your tiers of suppliers, and I'm just going to piggyback until I get to you. And that's what the SolarWinds hack was. That was a digital hack, but the same idea. It's a supply chain hack. It's got its own name. So understanding where risk is, that's critical. The stuff on the right, or whichever direction you're looking at, I'm not going to go into in great detail, but when we talk about new tools, there are tools like augmented analytics. And by the way, this is not some random term a consultant came up with. It's actually a real thing. And it helps you take that, if you go back to the risk, all the risk dashboards we have, it cuts across, like I was saying in the example of the threat vectors a few slides ago, it cuts across and pulls out information for you, and it helps you make better decisions. Skills, culture, I hate to admit, but I don't want to tell Susan how bad my Excel skills are, but they're pretty dismal. But we need to get these skills, and we need to, and really, there's a whole new set of skills to be digitally enabled. But most importantly is the biases. We struggle to articulate and admit our biases. And we all have them, and as organizations we have them, and the people that serve you have them as well. So we have biases, we need to look for them. And we need to move beyond the four walls, because you can't do risk alone. And what's even worse is nearly every Fortune 500 company spends time illuminating the same suppliers. So you waste all this time and money thinking that you're illuminating something that's new and unique, and somehow we're different. This CPG company is different from that CPG company, and that pharma company is different from that med device company, and that bank is different than that bank. Guess what? You're all using 90% of the same suppliers, and you're wasting all this time and money illuminating something that is really a commodity. And the reason that's important is because your risk is coming from nation states. It's not coming from your competitors anymore. We've entered a new world. Even Russia right now is suffering from this. One of their arms suppliers in Belarus got hacked, and all of the schematics of the weapons that that supplier produced are all over the internet. So when nation states are involved, it's a whole different scale, and the only way you can do this is to come together with others in the same situation. So, 3 things to do now. You have to reduce the number of suppliers you manage. The number of clients that I have that have 50,000, 75,000, 100,000 suppliers, they're proud of that, but that to me just says risk all over it. That is a problem. You cannot manage 50,000 suppliers. You just can't do it. You certainly can't manage 75,000. And 100,000, I'm just going to laugh you out of the room. Because you just do not have enough resources to manage them effectively. Remember, onboarding, operational, offboarding, that's why we lose focus in operational and offboarding. And so we need to reduce that. Move these off to other entities, the third-party entities that can manage this for you. There are great technology solutions emerging. They have their own risks too, so it's not a panacea. But we need to get a handle on it. And if you have 50,000, my argument is that you should have 100 Tier 1 suppliers, 1,000 Tier 2, and that's who you manage. Everybody else, get them out of your systems, because they're just posing a huge risk for your systems. And we haven't even talked about how vulnerable your P2P systems are. But that will be for another time. Look for IP risk both in your goods and services. I bet you if we looked at all your contracts, we would find a whole host of IP risk, and in ways that we wouldn't have thought about it. And then redesigning and simplifying our processes. This is critical, because the more complicated the process is, the harder it is to understand, and the harder it is to manage. I'll give you a bonus one on this one, mainly because I forgot to add it before I put it in, so I'll just call it a bonus. Is for your Tier 1 suppliers, actually do mini think tank sessions, half a day, a full day. Bring people in who are not invested in the outcome, which means no analysts, no consultants, no vendors. Get people from, who study Russian history or Middle East history or political science. Bring people, economists, bring them in and do these mini think tank sessions to really poke at what could go wrong with these suppliers and really just spend a half a day. I know it sounds crazy. I know everybody has 100 things on their to-do list, but this is what we have to work towards, or else you're going to run into these same types of supply shock or supply chain shocks. Now, I started by saying that liminal spaces are that space in between two things. So between contractors and employees, between physical and digital, physical or virtual and in real life. Liminal spaces can be new and emerging spaces as well. And that's where new risk is coming that we're not talking about yet. Because the first new and emerging space is cyberspace. Who owns cyberspace? Is it the companies that lay the pipes between the continents? Which, by the way, are fairly easily hackable. Is it the platform providers? At least the enterprise ones. How many Western enterprises use AWS, Google, or Azure? From a supplier risk point of view, we have concentrated almost the entirety of the Western infrastructure on 3 providers. Maybe that's okay, but it kind of seems like it could be a risk, especially if nation states are involved, because they're the ones attacking those 3. I put Meta on there just because whatever that turns out to be, that will be another new and emerging space, but I'm not really big on it. And the internet organizations. These folks run and define the internet as we know it. They create the new domain names. They create the protocols. You hear all this Web3 nonsense. These organizations are the ones defining the specifications, even down to which emojis get added, which are important. And so, do we know what's going on in these organizations? And will something happen like has happened to the US political system, and they get overtaken? This is political as I'll get today. But the point being is that a lot of this is happening and we take it for granted. And yet, all 3 of these are critical to our business operations, especially in light of the last 2 years. Sadly, the Arctic will be ice-free by 2040. So shipping lanes, which is going to be, it's already an environmental catastrophe. In the meantime, as the ice melts, new shipping routes are being added. And guess what these routes are? Contested spaces. These are liminal spaces, especially in regards to ownership, because not one country, countries claim ownership, but not everybody agrees on that. And so I would call your attention to the Northern Sea route, which is the yellow one, kind of hard to see, but that runs through the Russian Federation. And Russia has already spun up 50 former Soviet Union, military bases, because the Arctic's full of untapped natural resources and shorter routes. And incidentally, China is partnering with Russia on the development of this route. Meanwhile, the Northwest Passage runs right through Canada, or through Canada's territorial waters. Now, not everybody agrees, but Canada certainly thinks so. And so the question becomes, who owns these? How do we police these? If we're going to put commerce through there, because I guarantee you some consultant's going to come in and say, hey, let's start putting, let's run our optimization model through the Arctic. So these are liminal spaces that we have yet to define. And then there's, of course, my favorite, Elon is going to go to Mars. And this is the difference between corporate ownership versus government versus government. Who owns Mars? Can a commercial entity own Mars? We can't even agree on the Arctic. How are we going to agree on Mars? And because when he goes there, if he goes there first, does that give him first right of refusal? And my estimation is, and this is a guess, but I think nautical rules would apply, or nautical laws would apply, which is a whole different legal set of legal things. So this is certainly an emerging space, and it sounds way far in the distance, but it's actually not as far as we would think. And so the implications of this are huge, especially if a company, a publicly traded company, can own this. And we really haven't seen this since the British East India Company in the 1700s and 1800s basically conquered what is the modern day India, Pakistan, and Bengal, and that area. So we could be coming into another conflict. So all of this is to say is risk sits in these different liminal spaces. And so when we come back to the beginning, the reason I chose to talk about risk management is I think it illustrates this point. Because innovation sits in liminal spaces. Yep. Yeah, okay. I can project, oh, okay, there it is. I can project too, don't worry. To do innovation, to find suppliers to do innovation, you have to look in liminal spaces. You can't pull up the phone book, you can't do a Google search, you can't do a supplier identification search. It doesn't work. Innovation sits in liminal spaces, risk sits in liminal spaces, advanced cost savings sits in liminal spaces, social responsibility sits in liminal spaces. If you've read my current book, I do a case study on how forced labor happens and human rights violations happens in factories that are outside the view of Western eyes. Sustainability sits in liminal spaces. Good that we do supplier ratings, good that we do carbon emissions, but to move the needle, we have to move into liminal spaces. And so when you take this together, all of these 5 things together, this is our agenda for the next 10 years. And this is why I'm excited about procurement, and this is why I think now is absolutely the greatest time to be in procurement. Thank you.
All right, wow. Dr. Epstein, thank you so much.